since it's 12 o'clock here, we're going to go ahead and get started with another edition of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University monthly webinar series. And so it's my privilege this month to get to introduce Mr. Brent Rader, the Montana State Extension Sheep and Wool Specialist. There's been a lot of discussion on the future of the wool industry and where we're going and what kind of opportunities we have. And so we just wanted to invite Brent to tap into his knowledge and expertise of the wool markets and talk about some opportunities there as well. So with that, Brent, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jaylyn. Well, hopefully this will be a learning process for everybody. We're going to go through some history of, if I can get my slide deal to advance. I always have a problem with that. There we go. So agenda for the day. How did we get where we're at today? Where are we at currently? What are my options on wool? Where do we think we're going? A little bit of a look at the future of some wool issues, and then hopefully a good discussion, because I hopefully will learn as much as you guys. I know there's a lot of innovative stuff going out there with on wool in the industry, and so curious to hear some feedback from people on what they're seeing in their area, since we probably have people from all over the U.S. here. But let's jump into it. So the interesting fact is that we tend to forget as humans were really amazed by wool for about 9,930 years, and it's really only been about the last 70 years or so that we've lost our ability to be amazed by wool. You know, for 10,000 years, as far as we know, as far as the archaeologists can tell us, you know, sheep, humans, dogs, and rangelands and forest lands have lived in this symbiotic, there's a big word for you there, transhumance system that I think I heard somewhere, which is a fancy word for herding, moving livestock over time and altitude to keep stuff on the freshest grass to produce milk, meat, and wool when managed correctly. So we've kind of lost our amazement with the ability to produce wool from resources that we as humans cannot use, namely being grass and forbs out there on our rangeland. So a bit of a history level lesson for people that maybe are new to the industry. My family, I guess I wear a lot of hats. Come off a multi-generational sheep operation in Central Texas, moved up to Montana for grad school. And so I am the MSU Extension Sheep and Wool Specialist for Montana. I'm the supervisor at the Montana Wool Lab, I'm level 2 ASI certified classer, been a professional shearer for quite a while. And my wife started a value-added wool business making blankets, probably 7 or 8 years ago. So I've seen a lot of different sides of the industry, I guess, from all different areas, and tried to bring some of that into this presentation to give people a heads up. But I was in Australia for 3 weeks this summer, and when I brought this fact up, even the Australians were amazed that the U.S. in 1942 had 56 million head of sheep. I mean, we were a major player in the sheep industry on a worldwide basis and in wool manufacturing, really going back kind of pre-Revolutionary War time frame. We were a colony of England, and wool was one of their big exports. And between wool and cotton, we supplied a lot of the world industry for that. And then all in the early part of the 1900s and mid 1900s, we were fighting mostly Cold Wars in Europe and Asia between World War II and the Korean conflict and war. That created an extra demand, which really peaked wool prices to an all-time inflation-adjusted high. I think the exact date was about 1952. If I read an article one time that if Australian fine wool was inflation adjusted back to 1952 prices, it'd be worth $25 a pound grease right now. So that tells you how much the wool market has really changed in the last 70 years. And as most ag economists will tell you, high prices cure high prices. So because of those extremely high prices, manufacturers started looking for alternative fabrics to use for clothing. And polyester was first used or spun for clothing in the early 1950s was when they really started looking at it. You get in the early 1990s when I was leaving college, and those were really pivotal years for the sheep industry and the goat industry in the U.S. With the loss of the Wool and Mohair Incentive Program, which was a program that USDA administered that paid sheep and goat producers to produce better quality wool and mohair. Was not the funds did not come from taxes. They came from tariffs and quotas that were placed on imported fabric and wool and mohair coming in from other countries, and then that was paid to our growers to offset those prices. And so that happened in about 1993 was the last payment on that. And about the same time, we really saw a rise in free trade with China. And that kind of happened about the same time we also started this fast disposable cheap fashion trend that we're in now. And more recently, about 5 years ago, the COVID pandemic really disrupted our supply chains on a worldwide basis. The demand for wool for business attire, which was one of the big demands for wool, really shifted to kind of a next to skin outdoor wear. Hopefully that business attire market will come back a little bit as we get further away from the COVID deal. A historical look at prices, looking at cotton and wool. This was a chart that was produced by Mercado. It's an Australian firm, even though it has a Spanish name. They do a very good job of, it is a free website. It was subscription up till about 2 years ago, and then they made it a free website. But very good market updates on a worldwide basis for pretty much all the major commodities I deal with, which is cotton, wool, beef, and lamb. So you might check those guys out. But you can see the green line there that wool peaked all in the 1950s. It had a fairly major peak, and that was when we started spinning wool for or spinning fabric, making fabric out of polyester, and then we just had a long, slow decline, which really kind of followed the sheep numbers in the U.S. Cotton had a similar issue where it kind of it bounced along there pretty good, and then it's just had a slow decline down now where it is. It's sitting at 72 cents this morning is a pound is where it's sitting. It is interesting to see that big spike in cotton prices. That was right during the Civil War when the U.S. was a major supplier of the cotton industry. And you can see those massive spikes there, the Revolutionary War or pre-revolution. So it would have been probably the early 1800s up to about 1830. We still had a lot of wool demand going on around. One of the biggest industry issues that we face is how much imported fabric we are importing into the U.S. now. There's a lot of discussion on this in political circles. Obviously, since we're in a campaign season, a lot of talk about manufacturing jobs in the U.S. In 2023, though, we imported 8.5 billion pounds of synthetic fabric in the United States. That's actually down from 12 billion pounds in 2021, right after the pandemic. That equates to about 25 pounds of synthetic fabric per capita into the U.S. So it is a huge demand that we're seeing. And that's up from 2 billion pounds in 1990, which would have really been about the start of kind of this free trade era that we've been in for the last 30, 35 years now. And so about a 4 to 6-fold increase in imported synthetic fabric. And we've also seen a massive increase in imported cotton fabric also coming into the U.S. So we're kind of where are we at currently with the market. Our commercial wool market is obviously very constricted, and we'll go through some of those reasons. But really, right now, when we talk to our local buyers up in the Northern Great Plains, which is where I'm primarily located, we're very fortunate that we still have two very active buyers in this area, plus a fairly active wool pool system, which I know a lot of other states are struggling with the loss of warehouses and really not much of a pool system. And mostly what we're able to market here in Montana is primarily white wool. So no medium wool, no colored wool, no wool that has black fiber contamination or hair contamination. And that wool, to really market it well, is going to have to be under 22 micron with good length and strength. And probably one of the big deals is they definitely want below 2% veg or vegetable matter contamination. So that would be hay, straw, burrs, things of that nature. Ideally, they want it below 1.5%. And then on our fiber art wool, there's still decent demand. It seems like we've slackened off a little post-COVID on that. During COVID, we had a lot of people working from home, sitting around in their pajamas. They obviously weren't wearing business suits, and we had a lot of people experiment with the fiber art lifestyle and in terms of knitting and needle pointing and things like that. And so, wool, it still has good length and strength and maybe some really good luster, some unique color to it. Those wools, they were in pretty high demand during COVID. I think we've seen a little bit of a softening of that, just like we're seeing in the commercial market. Those wools really have to be very low in vegetable matter. That's why you'll see a lot of people that raise that type of wool either coating their sheep or coming up with a unique way to feed in terms of either just feeding pellets or something along those lines to keep that vegetable matter contamination as low as they can. One of the biggest questions I get is why are U.S. wools 85% of Australian wool prices? There's a couple of different issues when you talk to buyers out there. Freight is a big issue in the U.S. We're shipping wool out of Montana thousands of miles, either down to Texas or South Carolina, just to get it scoured. And so freight plays a big role in that. We just had a port strike that hopefully is going to be resolved. It sounds like they've made an agreement. They're kind of hashing out some final stuff on that. But those type of deals just compound the issue for us. And we do, as you can see from the core on the right side of your screen, that's actually a core sample from some pool wool. We do have quite a few issues with the polytwine contamination, paint, and vegetable matter contamination with our wool in the U.S. that Australia and some other countries don't deal with. And so those are some of the main reasons why a lot of times our wool gets discounted anywhere from 15 to 25%. So as far as where we're at right now, this is one of the latest updates. This is the ASI Market News app. If you've got a smartphone and you've not found this app, American Sheep Industry Association has a very good market news app that covers a lot of different things. It has reports on there about local markets in terms of San Angelo or New Holland lamb sales and things like that. But then they'll have the National Wool Review that's put up, and these prices are not based off of what wool is selling for currently in the U.S. These prices are based off of what the Australian Wool Exchange is selling wool for, and we'll get into those a little better. This one's nice because it is priced in U.S. dollars and in USD. So basically, all you have to do is find your micron category, multiply by yield, and then do any subtractions that you think you need to do in terms of quality and freight. The other thing that's out there, we do have, they just updated the wool LDP. So this is also on the American Sheep Industry Association webpage. And if you're not familiar with the LDP program or the loan deficiency payment, it's basically the USDA looks at at what wool is selling for or should be selling for in the US, based off of what the Australian Wool Exchange is selling wool for. So it's all by micron. And then they try to get a handle on what wool is selling for on a commercial basis in the United States. And if there's officially a difference between those two, so if US wool is selling for less than what it's selling for in Australia, then producers are eligible. There's some paperwork involved in it, but basically you go and apply at your farm service agency with USDA, and you can apply for a loan deficiency payment to make up for that cost difference, price difference there. So on the way you read that is on the graded wool, which this is stuff that you would maybe deliver to a warehouse or get a core on it yourself, core your bales and then send them down to Center of the Nation, or not Center of the Nation, Texas A&M lab, the Bill Sims lab in San Angelo. And currently right now on wool under 18.6 micron, there's an 81 cent per pound LDP. On graded wool, it's on a clean basis, so you have to multiply that 81 cents by your yield. So if your wool's only yielding 50%, you're going to get a 40.5 cent per pound LDP on that. If you are selling through a pool, you have to market it through an ungraded, through the ungraded side. And that includes everything. So a lot of times you'll see some of the bigger growers, if the LDP is better on graded wool, say on their main line, their AA, AAA, or A lines, they will get it cored and run that through to get the 40.5 cent a pound greasy. And then they'll put everything else like their tags, bellies, stuff like that. They'll run through the ungraded wool and get the current rate on that is 40 cents a pound. And that's just strictly on a greasy basis. So if you're not participating in the wool LDP, and I've heard lots of horror stories from different producers, because every county FSA office, a lot of times they'll interpret those rules a little differently, and that can create some issues for you. Pull up the chat. So this would be the official report from the Australian Wool Exchange. All the wool in the world, so every pound of wool in the world that's sold on a worldwide basis gets in the commercial system gets based off of the Australian Wool Exchange. It'd be similar to our Chicago Mercantile Exchange, those type deals where you have buyers and sellers of contracts, and they kind of set the price of wool out there. So the wool market was up on Tuesday a little bit. And so you look at those prices, they don't make a lot of sense to you. 21 micron in Sydney sold for 1,242 Australian cents clean. So if you want to back figure that yourself and try and figure out what your micron of wool is worth, you have to convert first to Australian currency. The current exchange rate is about 67 cents on the US dollar. Then you've got to convert it to pounds from kilos. So you've got to divide it out, multiply it by your yield, take your 75 to 80% discount for contamination, and then whatever discount you're going to get on transportation, depending on how far you are from your buyer. So when you run all those numbers, you're probably going to find that wool prices in the U.S. are still substantially lower than what they're getting in Australia for their type of wool, and that is evidenced by the LDP payment that we're also getting. So. The other place you can go to get a weekly update and some market commentary is AWI, or Australian Wool Innovation. So this is funded by a levy on all wool sold in Australia. They're just currently having a big vote right now to figure out what that levy level is going to be. They've been dropping it quite a while, and I don't know, some producers are worried that they're not going to have enough funding left to provide the level of services that most people are used to in terms of the research and extension work that they do down there, and I use them a lot for putting together materials for programs like this. So when you're trying to figure out exactly what you have, if you have quite a bit of wool or more than a bale or 2, 3 bales, for those larger lots, you're going to submit a core sample. Usually the warehouses do this. There's some disagreement over who can take a core sample in the US. We don't have what we call certified core technicians technically in the US, although the warehouses do provide that service for most people, and the buyers, potential buyers of clips tend to do a lot of this. We'll collect the core samples, and then they will send them to the Texas A&M lab in San Angelo for running, and we'll look at a report on what you get back on that. The main thing people need to realize, if you want to do this, if you want to hit a graded wool LDP, you need 24 cores, and so it's a tube. It's about a 3 or 4 foot long tube, depending on what you're doing. Steel tube, just like your corn hay bales. And you need about 24 of those cores, depending on the size of your tube. So if you only have 1 bale of wool, you're going to have to punch that bale 24 times. You can imagine what kind of mess it's going to make out of that bale to get that. And so when you go to Australia, they don't, most of the time, even though we were at one wool warehouse down there, they had 3 growers that delivered over 1,000 bales of wool to this one wool warehouse. And they would break all of that wool up into 20 bale lines. So they were taking 4 cores per bale on those 20 bale lines to get a high level of accuracy for the buyers that they had. But normally in the U.S., if your line of wool has 24 bales in it, you're going to take 1 core per bale. If you have 12 bales, you're going to take 2 cores per bale to meet that minimum number to get an official core test. So what are buyers looking at when they look at that official core test? This is an example of a core test off of one of our wool pools up here in Montana. So to read that report, the official mean fiber diameter is going to be run on a laser scan. This particular line was a 22 micron, 22 even. So the buyers are going to look at that. That's pretty close to what the market wants for a higher cutoff level right now. Coefficient of variation, we knew this line was pretty variable, so our variation was 22.7%. Which means we had some variability in there. Ideally, you'd want to be under 20% just to have more uniformity of processing. Also down there, you're going to see 2 figures. You're going to see percent of fibers greater than 30 micron is 5.3%, and comfort factor. And so if you subtract 100 minus 5.3, you end up with 94.7. That's gotten to be more something that people are looking at as we produce more next to skin fabric that can be worn next to skin versus, say, a mid layer or outer layer. And so the way that figure works is we have 5.3% of fiber ends that are greater than 30 micron. And at 30 micron, what happens is when a wool fiber end touches your skin, if it's greater than 30 microns, it won't bend. And so it makes a prickle, is what they call it. And so when you put on maybe an old sweater from your grandmother or something we produced years ago, an old army blanket, they were real scratchy and itchy, and you ended up with a rash. And a lot of people said they were allergic to wool. So what they finally figured out with some new technology is that if you can get the number of fiber, the percent of fiber ends below 30 microns, below about 1.5%, so about a 98.5% comfort factor, that wool then can be worn next to skin without having any prickle or itchiness issues. And so that's gotten to be a pretty important number in today's marketing areas as we're moving to that next to skin type fabric. Then you're going to move over to this line over here, the Schlumberger. This wool yielded 57.8%, which is about normal for our northern Montana wools, especially during a drought year where you're going to have more dust and things like that. And let's see, there was a vegetable matter. So the vegetable matter on this right over here, up above the mean fiber diameter was 1.4%. So we hit the target on that. We pulled quite a bit of really high veg wool out into another line. And that included, it gives you an estimate of hard twigs and burrs and things of that nature. It was really low, only 0.2% or so. So most of it was just hay material or straw. So we look at our you can look at our yield there was 20,178 when you take the gross mass, take out the declared tear, which would be your wool sacks that you had in to get you the net amount of wool was 34,910. Multiply that by your yield and you come out with 20,178. And we ended up with $1.35 greasy on this. So you can do the back figure, and this lot of wool was worth about $47,000 a couple of years ago. You know, in 2018, this line of wool was sold for a little over $3 a pound. So that tells you kind of where the market has moved over the last couple of years. So we don't all have enough wool to have several bales of wool and get core samples. The other way out there that you can figure out what kind of wool you have and get an idea, say if you're doing a fiber art or value added processing, maybe you want to sort this wool right on the shearing floor, you want to do some genetic improvement, look at what your U's are, what your Rams are, get an idea, target, maybe you want to do a next to skin value added processing. So you're going to have to start picking some genetics that are going to favor those types of wool. And so there's two ways you can do that. You can use the OFDA 2000 or the laser scan. Both those machines were developed and built in Australia. They are rather expensive. The OFDA 2000 is probably both those machines are going to be into the six figures. I'll just put it at that. That's why you don't see a lot of them in the United States. Both Montana State University and Texas A&M have both a laser scan and an OFDA 2000. The Wool Council, about 20 years ago, bought several of these machines of the OFDA 2000s and scattered them around the U.S. in a couple of different university settings. And so you might check and see if there's somebody locally that has one or in a neighboring state that you might be able to use. And then also there are not quite a few, but there are some private individuals that offer these services that do a very good job of coming out to the ranch and running stuff chute side for you to make that genetic improvement. These things, you get a lot of data. On the last report I looked at, we had 42 columns of data. And so you get a lot of information back. And sometimes it's kind of interesting trying to interpret all of the abbreviations that are there. But it gives you the option to pick and choose for what specifically you want to breed for. So mostly we can run down through this group of Rams here that we have at MSU. It'll give you the micron or the micron average. And normally, ideally, we would take this at shearing on 12 months fleece. You can do your lambs. They are going to change a little bit as they get older. So pretty uniform, 20.1 up to, there's a 19.4 up to a 24.7. So some variability in micron. We're going to look at the standard deviation and CV. Those are estimates of variability and how variable the wool is. Wool has a lot of variability to it, not only from, say, side to breech and belly to top. It also has variability along the staple. So as the nutrition of the sheep changes, it will vary in diameter along the staple as it grows. And then you also have variability from wool follicle to wool follicle. So two fibers of wool that are growing next to each other can also be extremely different in the variability of their micron. And so that's what these two estimates are. They're kind of giving you an estimate of what the variability of the fiber diameter variation is within those individual sheet, where a core test gives you the variability for, multiple sheep up to thousands. So then the CF percentage, that's comfort factor percent. Again, we want to be above a 98.5 if we're going to do a next to skin. So you can see it changes with micron. You can have some 23 micron sheet that you can wear next to skin. I don't see anything in here. There's a 24/7. You can see it's an 87.8% comfort factor. Obviously, the finer you get, generally, the higher the comfort factor. So you got that 19.4 at 99.6, 21.7 there at 99.1. Those would all be good for using for next to skin. And then staple length gives you an idea of how long the fleece is. This is in millimeters, so it's about 25.4 millimeters per inch. So we're about 4.5 inches long on this one. And you go down to this guy, I don't know what happened here. It might have been an older ram, only 65 mil. Ideally, you want them above about 75 mil at a minimum to process, depending on if they're ewes or lambs. And then curvature is an estimate of crimp. So the higher the curvature, the more crimps per inch, technically, you're going to have, or the more waviness you're going to see in the fleece. And that's one thing that our U.S. wools are known for is for high crimp. Actually, when we started entering this data into the Australian system for our EBVs, ASBVs, 99 was the highest number you could enter because they didn't have a lot of wool in Australia that was over 100 curvature, and so they ended up having to make a change to that. But here's a pretty decent ram, 21.2 micron average. He's just under the cutoff on comfort factor. We'd like to see him up around 98, 99, but pretty good length. He's about 5 inches in length on a 12-month fleece and 118 curvature, which makes a really nice crimpy type wool. And so somebody asked in the chat that wool is in high demand. Yeah, we do a lot of blending in the U.S. It's kind of like the grain industry or any other industry or making a ration. When you are putting together when you get the final specs for the fabric that you want, you got to remember that hardly anything is made with 100% wool. They're going to blend it with polyester. They're going to blend it with cotton, maybe hemp, things of those type nature. And so all of those things go into, they basically have programs they can sit down, blend all this stuff together. Maybe they don't have enough strength, and so they'll add poly in or hemp in to improve the strength on it, or it's not fine enough. They can blend it with finer wools out of Australia. Or maybe they want it for commercial use and they want a coarser wool, so and they don't have to worry about colors, so they can blend it with some medium type wool and get that blend that they want. So where are we going? A little overview of the history of the U.S. sheep industry. We were at 50-something million head, 1941. We've fallen down to 5 million head, or less than 5 million head. I'm talking to growers almost every week. We're in drought situation up here again, which seems to kind of be reoccurring more in the Great Plains in the Southwest and the Northern Plains. And so we're losing quite a bit of infrastructure. Wool is a worldwide commodity basis, and it's sold on volume. And that's how the brokers make their money. They make it off of volume on half cent per pound or a penny per pound, things of that nature. And when you start losing volume, it doesn't pay to keep the doors open on a warehouse. One of the other big issues we have in the U.S., we have 60 plus breeds of sheep, so we have a lot of variability in our wool, which in some ways is good, depending on what use you want for it. But in terms of selling it into an international supply chain, it creates some issues trying to combine that many different types of wool. The fact of the matter is that 70% of the world wool still probably goes to China for scouring. I think 98% of Australia's wool goes to China for scouring, something they're extremely worried about with the whole political issue with Taiwan and things like that. They're kind of out on an edge on that side of it. The U.S. is still fortunate. It's interesting that Australia, has 70 million head of sheep, and they have one kind of larger size wool scouring company left in Australia. There's rumors that they're going to shut it down. The U.S. only has 5 million head of sheep, and we have one very large scourer left, Chargeurs, and then Bowman in Texas would be considered a large scour facility, and then a lot of small scale scouring. So it's interesting to talk to producers in Australia that we actually have a lot more options than they do when it comes to doing value added processing, as tough as it even is in the U.S. One of the other issues we're currently facing in the U.S. is, we do send a lot of wool to China for processing. It's just a lot cheaper. I had one wool processor tell me they can ship wool out of Montana down to South Carolina and get it scoured for about 50 cents a pound, grease, or they can put it on a semi, send it to California, go through the dock or the port, load it on a ship, send it to China, have it scoured in China, load it back on a boat, bring it back to the port in California, and then ship it to the processor for about 35 cents a pound. So that just tells you the enormous cost of, they just have an unbelievable advantage in terms of labor laws and cost of labor, and about a 7-to-1 conversion on the dollar right now. The Chinese dollar is about 7 point something to the U.S. dollar. So they do have a big advantage in labor costs and environmental issues. They are trying to address some of that stuff though. So we're actually seeing their costs coming up, and a lot of the processing now is moving to Indonesia or North Vietnam because they're cheaper on their labor. So, but we do have a 25% tariff on raw wool that's coming from the U.S. going into China. If a Chinese company buys it out of the U.S. and brings it into China, they have to pay an additional 25%, which really makes it kind of cost inefficient for them. They don't look a lot at our wool anymore because of that. So let's talk a little bit about products, maybe for the next generation, this millennial generation. A lot of what we're seeing in terms of demand out there, it's going to be made with the superfine merino type wool or very, very high comfort factor wool that they're good base layers in the wintertime. You can wear them in the summertime. They have all the really good natural products that wool has in terms of moisture wicking and odor resistance and things like that. They're lightweight is another thing everybody's looking for. They're very comfortable. Evan Helly on our program at the Ram sale where we were discussing some of this stuff. I thought he brought up a great point. He said people feel safe in wool, and with all the issues going on in the world, whatever people can put on to make them feel safer, that's something that they're definitely going to look at. Most of our wool now is treated for easy care. The industry invested in a superwash system. Oh, that's been quite a few years ago now, that was installed down in South Carolina. It used to be that in order for us to produce a next to skin wearable fabric that was machine washable, it all had to be shipped to China for processing and then brought back. And so we didn't have that option to produce a next to skin machine washable product in the US, and we do have that option now. So that's opened up a lot of markets for some of our value added processors. Wool is trying to reclaim it I guess its perception as an environmentally friendly wool, and we'll get into this a little bit later with the greenwashing and stuff. But there is a huge I don't know how you want to describe it, but if you look at the rules for how you calculate sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions, the way they calculate it for wool is they go back and measure all the rainfall that falls on the ground on the pastures where the sheep graze to produce that wool. And then they follow that wool all the way through the supply chain, basically all the manufacturing, all the transportation through the retailer to the consumer. And so they've placed an incredible amount of I guess overburden on that final wool product, where when you compare it to something like polyester, all they do is they go back to when you pick up the polyester at the chemical factory, and then you spin it into a polyester fiber and make a shirt out of it and then ship it to Europe or wherever you're going to sell it. And so there are some discrepancies, especially in European laws right now, in terms of sustainability that are being fought on a worldwide basis that people need to be aware of, because basically wool is just playing on a pretty disadvantaged field out there right now in terms of being environmentally friendly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The demand right now for outdoor athletic wear, hunting type wear coming into hunting season has shown remarkable resilience, and hopefully that will continue. Cold as well as hot climate military applications. There were quite a few military applications that we put into use during the multiple Gulf wars that we had. And one of the things that we found is that if you're wearing polyester underwear and you're sitting in a armored personnel carrier and you get hit by an explosive device and you have a flash fire inside that personnel carrier, a lot of the issues they were having was that plastic or synthetic next to skin underwear that our men and women were wearing was melting into the skin, and they were basically having to cut big chunks of their skin off. As you can well imagine, that creates a lot of discomfort and created a lot of medical issues. And so we finally, I think towards the later end of that, a lot of those soldiers were wearing wool socks and wool underwear in those type climates because they didn't stink either. You know, you could wear them for quite a while where they were out in the field and didn't have issues that polyester has. And, you know, hopefully, I think there's some education going on out there in terms of synthetics, in terms of the how long it takes to break down, and we'll get into some of that stuff a little later. It's kind of hard to find American-made products, even trying to find American hemp, trying to find American-made cotton. They're starting to show up now a little better on social media and those type of platforms to be able to find those products finally. Let's talk a little bit about certified CLIP program. So a lot of this came about on a worldwide basis. You have your major retailers that their consumers were demanding a source verified product. They want to know that the meat that they're consuming, that the vegetables or the fruit or the coffee that they consume is being sustainably produced and ethically produced, and from an animal welfare issue and all of those type of environmental issues. And so we're even seeing the rise of that in the wool industry. A lot of the wool products originally started because of the practice called museling in Australia, because of the fly strike they have over there. They were basically having to strip some skin off the side of the tail at docking. And, you know, I guess the argument the producers over there have is, well, would you rather have them get fly strike, or would you rather have us strip the skin of them off? The marketplace basically said, We don't care either way. We don't want you stripping skin off. And so through genomics and some other selection processes, they're really transitioning the Australian Merino into more of a low wrinkle. They're breeding a lot of the wrinkles off the sheep to reduce their dependence on museling in some of those fly areas. And so, but these certified clip programs really came about by that. There's a couple of them out there. AWA, American Wool Assurance one, was one that was started by the American Sheep Industry Association a couple of years ago. It is a voluntary program. I think Pendleton Wool Mill pays a premium if you're AWA certified to sell wool through their program. The other one that's out there, major one, I guess there is ZQ that's out of New Zealand, but look like it's primarily for New Zealand merino producers. But we do have a pretty active RWS group here in the U.S. And both of those programs, basically you sign up for them. It's a certification process where they're going to come out and look at how you're handling your sheep. What does your range look like? What are your shearing practices? Is your crew doing a good job? And then basically sell that certified wool through some proprietary channels that maybe the commercial market doesn't have access to. A lot of the wool coming out of South Africa is RWS certified. Growing amount of it coming out of Australia and especially out of South America is running through these certification programs. So it'll be interesting to see where we end up in the long term with them. So I get a lot of questions. Just an FYI, we are building a new Montana Wool Lab when we're talking about where we're headed in the future. We had a wool lab built at Montana State University. It was completed in 1947, just turned 75 years old. It's on 3 different levels with a lot of concrete stairs, has some asbestos issues. The wet chemistry lab is pretty archaic by modern standards. And so Montana State University, the state of Montana, and some very generous industry partners donated to this. The walls are just going up. I just looked at it yesterday fairly quickly. I think we're going to move in the fall or the spring of 2026 is when they're saying we're going to be in. But why in the world would you guys, spend $10 million of state resources and over $1 million in private equity building a wool research lab? And I tell people, we're not really building this lab for us. We're building it for our grandchildren. I think at some point they're going to realize that we've created a real environmental disaster with all the synthetic clothing. It's probably one of the largest untalked about global issues out there. We're really focused on climate change right now. And when you start digging into the microplastic contamination of our waterways, it's going to be a big issue moving forward. And so the state of Montana and the university really felt, even though the wool market's really depressed and we have a lot of people selling sheep, that at some point in the next generation, this lab is hopefully going to provide the foundation to a resurgence in the wool industry in the United States. Potential new commercial uses for wool. We are doing some wool pellet research at Montana State University. So this would be feedlot type wool or tags, things of that nature. Colored wool, hair sheep, or wool cross type sheep that's hair contaminated that won't go into that commercial system. The big issue that we're seeing from an economic standpoint, from a real world situation, is that it costs about $3 to $10 a pound to make a wool pellet. And so when you compare it to commercial fertilizer on, say, an NPK basis, it's pretty low values compared to what's out there. And so a lot of the work that we're looking at, we just got, hopefully we'll get a grant next year to start spreading it on different fields. The work that we did at Fort Ellis this spring on some 1/10 acre plots, we did not see any difference there, even putting 500 pounds of wool pellets out in terms of the production of the forage or the nutrient value of the forage. That being said, this is a fairly high rainfall area with really good soil. and we top dressed those plots. They were in a larger field, so they got 100 units of nitrogen over the top of them in commercial fertilizer. And so everybody's like, well, why did you do that? And it's like, well, we kind of wanted to test it to the extreme and see, is there going to be something show up? We don't have all the soil results back in terms of the microbial profile and soil nutrients, but when we get that all that stuff finalized, we'll put it out. The nice thing about wool pellets, because I have a lot of people ask me, well, can I just throw a bale in my bale buster and blow it out on my field and let it incorporate that way? You certainly can do that or try to do that. We've looked at a couple of different options for how to do that. But the one thing you have to remember is that by pelletizing it, you're making it a weed-free product because the pellets heat up to about 150, 160 degrees. And so, especially if you're trying to sell waste wool into like uh, a local hardware store or something as a replacement for peat moss, as in a gardening type system, you're probably going to want to stick with more of a pelleted deal unless you have extremely clean wool out there. So looks like we've got a few questions in there. And so one of the questions we had was, yep, see wool tested in low quality soils. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So the next project, the larger scale one that we're moving to, this was just a small preliminary study. We're going to look more at dryland systems with silty, sandy type soil profiles and probably low nitrogen inputs, and do that in a replicated system, probably looking at both fall and spring applications. So hopefully that project will be up and running by next year. And the lab's open. We have two half-time managers at the lab. One of them is a PhD student. It just works easier because we get so busy in the spring. So there may not be somebody at the lab 24/7. So normally we recommend people call the wool lab and just make sure that somebody's going to be there if you're going to be dropping samples off. And you can certainly most of the people just mail samples to us is how they do that. And there has been a lot of talk about preloading, either doing a lot of different ideas about how to do a wool pellet. Do you do a wool hemp pellet? Do you do a wool wood pellet and then load them with a fertilizer product? And that type stuff is certainly something that people are kind of looking at too. Or a heavy clay. Yeah, that was one thing I hadn't thought about, but super heavy clay, possibly you might get might develop a little better soil profile if you put it into a heavy clay situation. Where do you send unusable wool to be pelletized? The largest facility right now in the U.S. is Wild Valley Farms down in Croydon, Utah. You can look them up online, but they do by the semi load. So if you're looking at large volumes, the Canadian Wool Cooperative just had a semi load done this spring down there for use up in Canada. And if you get online, we're pretty fortunate here in Montana. We've got goodness, Cami Noise's place down at Ranching Traditions Fiber down out of Whitehall has a small scale pellet mill. But there's getting to be more and more of them popping around out there that, if you're just wanting to do your tags or bellies or kind of some tail end stuff for your own use, you can certainly do that. The one thing that I should mention that I didn't put on the slide is that actually Albert Wild has the patent. He does not have a patent on making wool pellets. He has a patent on selling wool pellets as a soil amendment. And the reason he ended up patenting it, Albert is very good to work with. You can certainly call him and talk to him if this is something you're thinking about doing on a large scale. If you want to sell it commercially, you're going to have to talk to him. But he developed this process. We'll definitely give Albert all the credit for this that figured this system out and did a lot of the early work in greenhouses with it, working with some large commercial growers in the area. But Albert said he immediately had two companies that were based in foreign nations that wanted to buy the patent from him and basically take the process and kind of, I guess, use a lot of imported wool that's a lot cheaper than what the U.S. is, and basically undercut the market that Albert's been trying to develop for wool pellets. And then he said he had multiple offers from other countries around the world that basically said, we will send you wool pretty much at cost just to get rid of it. And Albert's really trying to do a pretty good job, and the other smaller mills out there are doing a really good job of trying to return some revenue back to growers on the pelleted mills, and not just basically pick it up for nothing where the grower doesn't get any money back on it. So one of the other things that's come about in terms of the genomic side, we talk a lot about precision ag and in farming systems. We've tried to integrate a lot of this stuff into the university system to try and demo it for producers. So like on the shearing floor, we can use electronic ear tag technology that's linked to a portable printer that prints out a barcode. And it'll follow that fleece. We can get a weight on that fleece that'll enter into the system. We can catch all of that OFDA data, micron, comfort factor, all of that stuff, not only for use for our EPDs, but also for sorting different lines of wool. And if you're not collecting, if you're just sorting for production lines, for clothing production lines, I think we've hit about 180 an hour running on the OFDA. So the technology's there to really do this at scale in the US if people are interested in doing a very intensive value-added sorting off the shearing floor. You just have to find somebody that has a machine that's willing to come down and spend the amount of time that it takes to sort that wool. As long as you have a market for it, you can certainly do it. Now that we have an LDP again for quite a few of the different graded wools, which is pretty new. We did a lot of this work 20 years ago where we would go into a big operation and they would want to do an 18.5 line to hit that 40 cent LDP. And so that's another use for that system. So we talked a little bit about some of the issues that wool has out there that we're fighting currently on an international level. There's one called greenwashing. There's a lot of this going on where a company that produces a fully synthetic fabric, they're going to make a lot of statements about how much of it's recycled, and there's what they call a new biodegradable plastic out there. It's really not a biodegradable. It just breaks down faster, kind of like some of the new polytwine out there. You just don't see it, but it's basically being incorporated into the soil and into our water. Some of the work out there, I'll give Patagonia credit for this. They were the ones that really figured this out early on, that with some of their product lines, say a real fuzzy type synthetic vest that was made to imitate fur, those are horrible for releasing synthetic fabrics when you actually wash them. And some of the fabrics they've tested can release up to 4,500 microfibers per gram. So there's 454 grams in a pound. You're talking about millions of microfibers being released when you wash some of this stuff. And it's bad enough now that in France, I think in 2025, France is going to require that you put a filter on all of your washing machines to keep it out of the fresh water system. So it's starting to show up in our oceans. You can take, I'm not going to go into all the details, but they just found it in coral. They're finding that they think that coral absorbs about 30% of the microplastic that's in the ocean because it is a filter feeder. And so now they're starting to look at, is some of the coral die-off that's occurring around the world, is that maybe it's not due so much to ocean heat or CO2 level or pH, but maybe it's a microfiber or microplastic issue with those corals. Most of that fast fashion ends up in the landfill. There's no environmental price tag for that when they figure those sustainability laws. And that's one of the things everybody's trying to work on an international basis. And then a little bit about what I talked about where they don't calculate the supply chain impacts. And let's see if I can get this thing to work. I may not be able to. So these are some of the ads that are going on. This one was just released about 2 weeks ago. See if we can get it to play. It talks about this issue of microplastics and sustainability of fabric. And it doesn't sound like the sound's playing, but they're basically just trying to get people to realize what a problem this is in the world. So this is basically all uh, synthetic fabric that's been turned into clothing. And we don't realize how much of it's out there. So you have all these people wearing wool that are trying to navigate all this synthetic clothing that people are discarding. It just like is a unbelievable mass of plastic clothing. And where does it all end up? Yep, down in the environment and in our water. So pretty good ad that picked up a lot of traction lately. So hopefully we'll continue with those type ads out there. But that's the Woolmark company that put that one out there, a subsidiary of Australian Wool Innovation, really well known for that. And then over on the left, you can see American Wool Council, American Wool, ASI does a pretty good job, has a good website of talking about those issues also. As we get down to the bottom, some other major issues, if you're talking to buyers out there, people that are looking at wool product, we call them the flyover states, the Midwest. You look at that picture of those sheep grazing native rangeland in Montana, and most people, it's just boring. But that's really where all our clean water, clean air, open space, all that stuff comes to. And we've really lost an appreciation for that and having livestock out there to graze those landscapes and keep them healthy, keep our fire interval down, provide wildlife habitat. There was a research project that actually came out of China using satellite data. And they figured that over the past 35 years, we've paved over 142 million acres of basically rangeland or forest land in the world with impervious substances like concrete and asphalt. And when you put it on our terms here in the Northwest, that's basically you're gonna pave over Idaho every 13 years. And I don't think we realize the magnitude of that issue and the long range problems that we're gonna have with it. But it's one thing I like to talk about too when I'm talking to people that are looking at wool and sustainability issues. So U.S. made wool clothing. We had a seminar. You can find a link to it on the Montana Wool Lab page. We interviewed 3 different companies in this area: Duckworth Wool Company out of Dillon, Montana, Fishhook Socks out of Bison, South Dakota, and then the Mountain Meadow Wool Company out of Buffalo, Wyoming, to talk about what they saw as far as the future of U.S. wool manufacturing, maybe on a small to mid scale size, not looking at the large brands out there, but how much opportunity is there. And Mike Rose doing a really good job talking about some of this stuff on his podcast. He was the one that pointed out in the 1980s, 70% of clothing worn by Americans was actually produced in the U.S., and that figure sits at about 3%. I've seen some other figures that said it's about 2% now, and we're importing the rest of it. And so just trying to get people to realize that, and buy those American-made products. They are expensive, but I think we're finding out we're paying a big price on the backside of that. So what are my options? We're going to run through briefly some of this stuff, and then hopefully we'll get some questions or some suggestions from people, because like I said, I'm here to learn just as much as you guys. Looks like we've got a good number of people on the webinar today, and maybe we'll generate some new research ideas from some of those questions. So store and wait. I know producers that have 7 years of wool sitting in a dry van right now. You know, that's a long time to wait for a price. Basically, since 2018, they haven't sold any wool. The last time the wool market peaked, there's a lot of warehouses that do have probably this in February. It seemed like a lot of growers in this area really they had 2 years of wool in storage, and they were looking at in having 3 years of wool in storage, and the warehouses were getting pretty clogged up, and the market jumped just a little bit there, and there was some interest in from the mills to buy, and so a lot of people unloaded the wool early this spring, and kind of cleaned the warehouses out, which was nice to see. So that's where the commercial market is right now. There's not a lot of activity this time of the year. That market hopefully will pick up after the first of the year, and we'll see some increased demand. The shearing season starts coming on. They're just shearing in Australia right now, so those are the wools that everybody's buying right now, is in the southern hemisphere, as those wools start to hit the market. And in our spring of the year, then that's kind of our marketing season, is usually how it works. You can look at a value added process, and we'll run through some of the pros and cons of that. Look a little bit at some of the fiber art programs, or is that something you want to look at? I tend to view value added as the commercial markets, obviously the big scale. The value added's more of a medium to small scale, and then fiber art, for the most part, just because it is art and a lot of it's handmade, tends to be by definition a smaller scale. And then honestly, we have some growers that are just collecting the LDP and hauling it to the dump, or dumping it in a coulee somewhere, or trying to spread it on a field. They're getting their 40 cents. If the ewes are shearing 10 pounds, they're getting $4 a pound out of it, and insurance costs them 5 to 6, so they're happy. They're only losing $2. And unfortunately, we are seeing some of that. We're seeing a lot of it in England right now, where they have a lot of strong wool, carpet wool type sheep that have colored fibers, and you end up with a lot of wool in storage. So let's run back through the. Yep, and Jalen posted the link to both the Woolmark video and the program that we did at the ram sale in Miles City. So thank you, Jalen, for that. So commercial markets, I tried to keep some of this stuff positive, because Lord knows I spend enough time talking to producers on the phone about how bad things are with the lamb market right now and the wool market. So we're going to try and take a positive spin on the commercial markets today. We did have some stabilization now with testing since Texas A&M took over the commercial grading. When our only commercial testing facility in Colorado closed about 6-7 years ago, we were having to send all of our wool to New Zealand for testing, which obviously created some issues. And then with the COVID supply issues and transportation, it was nice to have Texas A&M step up to the plate and take on the responsibility of that commercial grading lab. So we have that option here in the U.S. We are gearing up for more research in Montana with our new lab. We're writing a lot of grants right now, a lot of equipment type grants to refurbish stuff. A lot of that equipment almost doubled or tripled in price since COVID hit. And so it's been an interesting experience as a lab manager, trying to refurbish a lab with all new equipment. And we have been talking to a young man. They are developing a new lab, the Fashion Innovation Center up in Troy, New York. It's kind of along the Hudson Valley. There has been a long stronghold for wool processing, going way back, 100, 200 years now. And so they stepped up to the plate, and they will be developing a new lab, a new wool lab in Troy, New York, to kind of support a lot of the work that some of the mills that are expanding up in that area, new mills that are coming online, maybe on a small to mid-scale type size. But it's really nice to see that and have another lab out there that we can collaborate with on projects. we are starting to see a lot of new startup wool clothing companies in the U.S. that have some scale to them, that have enough volume that they can either run through Bowman or Chargeurs. We've got the Pendleton Wool Mill company that has a long history of serving the Northwest and some mills up in New England. And there's a lot of them out there that are kind of adding new products as consumer preferences change. And so hopefully we'll see that continue. And also we've seen several new small and mid-size early wool processors. So from the scouring side come on, and some large processors, specifically in the dyeing, and then with the addition of the with the machine washable process, have been upgrading their equipment. So that's added a lot more opportunity. And I can't reiterate talking to producers in Australia how frustrated they are with their absolute lack of producing an Australian made wool product. Almost all of that product goes to China for processing, gets cut and sewn in Indonesia or North Vietnam, and then comes back into Australia as they can say they can technically say it's Australian wool, but all the processing is done somewhere overseas. But we are seeing quite a bit of interest since COVID also with developing this friend-shoring supply chain with Mexico. They've been a good partner with some of our larger processors in Mexico or in the US. So we don't have to go all the way to China. We may have to send it to China to scour, but they're developing some, especially on the wool felt side, it seems like some processing capability down there to open up some new markets for our US wool other than China. Value-added enterprises. This is an interesting one. It's nice to travel around the country and see and visit with these companies that are trying to do this value-added enterprise. It's almost like starting from scratch, since we basically packaged up all of our major processing wool processing equipment, or the majority of it, and shipped it off to China 30 years ago. In some ways that's bad, and in some ways it's good, because a lot of these companies that are coming online are basically investing in the most current technology, a lot of automated systems, which cut labor, produce a beautiful product that's basically consumer ready from the start. And so in some ways it is kind of nice that we're starting over from scratch on some of this stuff, as long as we can keep our major early stage processors running. The one thing I did want to add in about value-added enterprise, I talked to a lot of people that were unaware of this. So if you have anywhere along that supply chain in the manufacturing system, when it leaves your ranch as raw wool, pretty much anywhere along that supply chain before it comes back as a final product to you, if there's an issue, if somebody messes it up, if they mess the dye up, if they mess the spinning up, if they mess the finish up, if any of that stuff, you're basically just out product. And that's a big surprise to a lot of people that get into the value added deal. It looks really easy on the early side. Everybody really thinks they produce good quality wool until they have it processed once, and then they figure out they either have a vegetable matter contamination issue, or you have a black fiber issue, or you have a strength issue, which is the other big one in the U.S. We're currently trying to get a strength tester for our lab so we can start working on that. But once you figure all that out, if somebody messes the dye up, you're just out. They just send you the stuff back. There's no insurance, no recourse, and so you've really got to have a good financing plan, because you're about 18 months from shearing to getting a finished product back, and that's pretty standard. You're almost 2 years. You're 2 years. You're going to have two years of wool clip in that value-added supply chain before you even get a product back that you haven't even marketed yet, before you can start selling it. So you're going to need a good, sound business plan if you're going to make that jump. The other issue that we ran into early on was there's some companies out there that will tell you you're getting your wool back. That technically is true when you dig into the fine details of what they're doing. Maybe you have 2,000 pounds of wool, but they want to scour at 10 to 12,000 pound batches. So they're going to mix your wool with some stuff that looks pretty similar to it. And technically you're getting your wool back, but it might only be 20% your wool and 80% somebody else's wool. So if you are really wanting 100% source verified product, you really need to go meet with those supply chain people and make sure that they can guarantee that for you. Um, most of the marketing, most of those sales right now, talking to a lot of the people out there, it's almost all direct marketing on social media. Hard storefronts are just so expensive now, with the COVID lockdown and everything, that most of them are just doing direct marketing on social media. There's one big advantage of U.S. wool is that we have a lot of crimp or curvature, and that's great for resistance to compression. So we see a lot of U.S. socks made out of U.S. wool. When you go to Australia, you hardly see any Australian socks made out of wool because they bred all the crimp out of their wool to make a fiber that would lay very flat and could be spun very fine and make a really high-end business suit. So they pretty much bred all the crimp out of their wool. So currently that is one of the advantages of most U.S. wool, is that it has high crimp and resistance to compression. And then just looking at that comfort factor, that's a hard one to hit. When you start looking at comfort factor and making improvements on that, getting a clip that's above 98% comfort factor is a lot more difficult than what you would think it would be. From a fiber artist standpoint, as a shearer, I shear some of these places. Phenomenal type of wool. It is a completely different system and thought process than the commercial industry on a lot of different aspects. Some are the same, but some are different. A lot of this wool, like that's bagged up here, none of that would be accepted into the commercial industry, where they want a 22 micron completely white wool with no black fiber contamination. And so we are fortunate to have a lot of small scale mills around the U.S. to help those producers who want to do a fiber art type product, a kind of a home cottage industry, or maybe even a small scale industrial type deal, produce some really beautiful knitwear knit or felt wear is where a lot of it's going into, high luster, beautiful colors on that stuff. I would say the biggest issue with that is if you're looking at going into that system, you're gonna have to figure out, especially in the northern Great Plains where we feed a lot of hay because of winter, figuring out how to manage your vegetable matter contamination is a major issue. I can't tell you how many of the small mill owners I've talked to that how frustrated they are where somebody has a really beautiful fleece, spent a lot of money on some genetics and feeding them properly and everything, but the wool is half hay or straw, and it's really, really difficult on a small scale mill to remove that. The other thing to think about is these wools, a lot of them, they can be coarser wools. So, 30, 35 micron, depending on what breed you have. And a lot of them have an unbelievable handle. So the feel of the wool, they're very soft and luxurious before they're processed. And it may take you a few times. I've seen wool that has been sent to the same wool that's been sent to two different processors. The one yarn came back very luxurious, very soft to the handle, ended up with a beautiful scarf out of it. The other wool, because of the twist and the tension on it and how it was spun, ended up almost feeling like barbed wire because it just basically poked all of those coarse ends out, and you could literally run your hand down that yarn and feel all those ends prickling you. And so you really have to know your product and how you're going to process that product and work with those mills to figure that out. And so kind of one of the final things here, uses for wool that do not fit into the commercial system. So you don't want to throw it in the dump. You don't want to store it. You don't want to do the value added processing. You don't want to go into the fiber art system. There are a couple of different uses out there. I'm not going to say that there's much money being generated on them right now, but we'll see where we get to. Probably the most common is a garden mulch. We put all our tags in the garden. kind of a slow release fertilizer and a weed barrier a little bit. If you're looking at doing something with either garden mulch or wool pellets, I've talked to some of the major marketing teams and purchasers for some of our big like farm stores here in Montana. And they said if you can convince us and convince consumers that wool is a good peat moss replacement, we will buy into it and put it on the shelf, because there are a lot of issues with the sustainability of peat moss right now. And a lot of people are looking for some avenues to do something to replace peat moss that's going to be more environmentally sustainable. We have had pretty good luck, or people have told me they've had good luck using raw wool when they're doing nursery tree planting. So if you're planting windbreaks or orchards or any type of tree planting, just putting a pound or two of wool in the bottom, especially on a bare root type planting, just that moisture retention and that little extra nutrient. I've had people tell me that is a very good use for that type of wool. We'll sell some of our really poor quality wool that we can't do anything with that comes out of the commercial system. So it's either black fiber contamination or hair sheep contaminated or just super high in veg. And we'll press those up into a regular, nylon pack, 450 pounds. You basically have 4 different sides on there that you can paint a target. If you look at what those styrofoam archery targets sell for, you can sell a wool bale for $300-400. So 75 cents or $1 a pound. It's another way, or a backstop for a shooting sports program, a 4-H shooting sports program. You can probably get a donation, at least, a tax write-off on that. Insulation is something that has been tried several times. They're taking a low value wool, they're basically scouring it, fluffing it, and depending on what you're doing, some of them will felt it into pads. The biggest issue I've heard on that, especially on the loose wool, is that it takes about 30% more. Every project the one individual did, he delivered the amount of wool that the bookwork said he was supposed to deliver, and it always took 30% more than what the bookwork said it was supposed to take. So that was his big issue with the insulation deal and going down that road. This is a picture on the left. It's a British company called Cool Wool. They have a major backlog of wool in the UK right now. It's very coarse, and it has a lot of color contamination to it. And so they are really into either doing mailing packages using that wool. They'll basically wash it and then felt it or needle felt it to get these type pad products. But this was the first one that I'd seen where they were actually using it as a insulated delivery package for medical devices. So, yeah. Yep, and somebody did post on there that wool would make a good biodegradable pot, like the version of cow pots. That's certainly true. That's I saw somebody that was playing with that for a while, but it would be an interesting one. You could just steam press it into a pot like that and get it to stay. I think from a horticultural standpoint, there's probably a lot of different options out there that we haven't even thought about, and could make some big uses on. The other one, other than packaging, we did try doing some reclamation fabric, since wool is natural biodegradable rather than using the poly netting out there. So basically, this is if they're doing dirt work along a roadway, they could just needle felt a real thin fabric of wool and impregnate it with some native grass seeds or native forb seeds. The biggest issue we had with this product when they were trying to develop it is you can't guarantee it's weed free, all of that stuff. So all the hay or straw that's used in those reclamation projects has to be certified weed free. And that was probably the biggest issue. And so trying to figure out economically how you treat that volume of wool, whether you microwave it or irradiate it or steam it or something, when you ran the numbers on it, it just wasn't going to be economically viable to use it for that. And with that, I think we're pretty good shape. I was trying to answer questions as we came through. We'll see what comes through. And yep, wrapping beehives, northern beehives, breathable, and doesn't have a lot of chemicals in it that may bother the bees. So I do think there's a lot of options out there. There's a lot of people exploring options because obviously the wool market is not in real good shape right now on a commercial basis. The value added stuff seems to be slowing down a little bit with the economy the way it is. People's disposable income is not super good right now, and so they're just kind of holding back on their spending a little bit. But I think the future is bright. If I didn't think the future in the wool industry wasn't bright, I wouldn't be working to build a $10 million wool research lab. I can guarantee you that. So, okay.
There's been a couple.
Any other? Whoop,
Oh.
go ahead, Jalen.
There's been a couple kind of around those coarse wools. I think you kind of alluded to this in your last slide, and the future of coarse wools. Somebody else asked about wool carpet as an opportunity for those wools. But is that just not viable due to production cost?
We used to produce some wool carpet in the U.S. New Zealand has been in New Zealand, and I would say England were a lot of times the sources of those wool carpets, and they're shutting down one of the last wool carpet mills in New Zealand right now because they can't compete with polyester. People are just going for that cheaper alternative. If you ever get to Australia, go south of Melbourne. There's the National Wool Museum, and they actually have a carpet, one of the last operating carpet manufacturing machines in Australia. And there was a gentleman there that had worked at the factory. There used to be quite a few of them down in Geelong, and so he gave us the whole history of kind of the sad history of how the Australian carpet industry just kind of fell apart over time, over about the last 50 years. They basically closed down, they boxed all the equipment up, they sent it to China, and then he said they hired the guys that ran the equipment for a year to go to China to teach everybody how to run the equipment, and that was it. He said it was really sad. So,
There is another one here, and maybe this is a question, kind of some advice that you can give, but farm flocks with some polypay ewes in the Midwest are getting 5 to 10 cents per pound. Do you foresee any possible strength in the market, or how can we take advantage of more of that dollar on those
yeah,
courses?
yeah, and we have a lot of. I mean, I've got poly producers here in Montana and small farm flock, and so if you're selling into the commercial industry, it's all on volume. And so that was the whole premise behind the original wool pool systems. We're going to take like wool from a lot of different producers and try and get some economies of scale from a marketing standpoint. 24 years ago, when they started our Eastern Consolidated Pool, we were delivering 200,000 pounds from 7 different wool pools. And this year, we only took our line one this year, so we only delivered about 35,000 pounds. But in a normal year, we would do about 60,000 pounds. So we're even losing volume out here in that type setting. But at least from that standpoint, they can get enough volume together that you can get a core on it, and so it just takes some organization at a state level or a county level. The other issue we've run into with a lot of producers out there is I've seen some phenomenal farm flock wool. There's people that do an unbelievably good job on the genetics, on the feeding, on the management. Some of our best wool comes out of farm flocks. But you also see the other side where a lot of producers are, I've got 25 head of sheep. I'm doing a hothouse lamb project where I'm getting 99% of my income off the lamb. wool is an expense for me because it costs me $10 a head to get them shorn, and I'm getting 5 cents for the wool. So I absolutely don't care about it. I'm throwing hay over their back. I'm spray painting them, not picking up my poly twine. And so when you start getting that type of wool into the system, it really detracts from the people that are really trying. And that's always been the hard thing with a pool system is how do you be fair to the people that are doing an extraordinary job of producing and putting up high quality wool? And then when you just look at it from a micron standpoint, yeah, we're going to throw all this wool together, and some of it might be 1% veg and 24 micron, and then the other stuff's 24 micron with 7% veg. And so what's the trade-off there to keep an economies of scale? But those are some of the things that we even deal with out here on that level.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. So we'll take just a couple questions. There's two left here that we'll take. Do you have any thoughts on cashmere or angora for those producers?
Yeah, that's really tough. It's there. So when I was growing up in Texas in the early 90s, we had 2.5 million head of Angoras in the state of Texas. We had a lot, I shared a lot of Angoras. And now they figure there's 80,000 Angoras left in the state. And so that market is really the goats that are left down there are very high quality. Obviously, they produce very fine hair. The cashmere deal came into Montana even hard 15, 20 years ago and kind of petered out. It Everything I've read on the cashmere deal is you just can't compete with Mongolia. That they are basically turning Mongolia, I guess I've never been there, so I mean what I read on it is they're turning it into a major desert just by there's a bit of a gold rush there, and people are running way too many goats than they should be running, and so they're having a lot of issues with rangeland management in that country, and it's really difficult to compete with them on price, comparatively speaking. But my great uncle, who was born in 1905, bought a Chevy car in the 50s that had mohair seat covers. Um, it's pretty interesting. So both those fibers are very well known historically fibers. They have unbelievable good uses. It's just a matter of you know um, who's going to put up the money to build the infrastructure. That's what a lot of it comes down to, even in our industry. When we talk about where we're headed in the future, it costs so much. Um, Even to build this lab, we budgeted $5 million 6 years ago, and now we're closing in on 10 to build. And the mills are in the same boat, just being compliant with EPA water quality issues and labor issues and finding labor. It's all the same deal. But with the cashmere and mohair, they're probably going to have to find a small scale mill that they can work with to produce some kind of value added or fiber art type deal. But yeah, great fibers out there. It's just, yeah, what do we do with them now moving forward? So
Perfect. And then the last one, do you have an idea on what it would cost to set up a small scouring facility?
oh, well, that's a good question. My wife just submitted a grant for it. Um, to do the math, to look at what it's going to cost. So we had uh, so if you search online, they actually did this study about 15 or 20 years ago in California. There actually is a published paper on looking at the economics of setting up a mill. My wife just wanted a fresher look at it, and so whether or not she gets the grant funded or not, but she was looking at that. Um, the way I explain it to people is we had a small scale um, uh, meat harvest facility, and they were already cutting and wrapping meat, had a facility to do that. All they wanted to do was build a wing on where they could harvest animals, um, and and have a water treatment facility. And just to add that harvest wing on, so this is, I mean, they're maybe doing like 2 beef or a beef a day, so not very big at all. The water treatment part of that facility would have been over $1 million. That was almost 10 years ago, you know. So um, Ben Hostetler probably is one of the best on that because he is an engineer by training. He built his mill basically from scratch, you know, bootstrapped it up, as you would say. And he has a very unique mill, and he is 100% recycled on his water. And so I think that is going to be one of the keys when you start digging into that process is how are you, you know, first is there a market there for whatever type of wool or the location that you're going to scour it? You know, your biggest deal is probably going to be what are you going to do with that water? Because it is treated as industrial wastewater by the EPA. And so they have very strict requirements on how you handle that wastewater if you're going to release it back. And so that is by far the biggest question I tell people, man, if you're looking at doing one of them, it's probably all going to be on your first big hurdle is going to be wastewater management.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, there's also some really good discussion in the chat if anybody hasn't checked that out yet. But with that, I think thank you, Brent, for your time. And we've had lots of comments on how informative this was. And so we really appreciate your knowledge and insights today.
Yep. Nope. You guys keep up the good work. This is a good series you got going. Been following it for quite a while. So yeah, it's good. We appreciate it. So,
Yeah. Thanks, Brent. And
all right.
hope to see you all join us next month.